Hey everyone, and welcome back to a new video of mine. Today I want to give you a couple of reasons as to why you are struggling with learning languages. So if you want to know, then definitely stay tuned. Alright, before we get into this video, if you want to learn any language, then please check in my bio. There you find the language apps I absolutely recommend. So without further ado, let's get right into today's topic. The number one reason I think why people are struggling learning languages is fear. And I've mentioned that so many times. Fear is one of the biggest, if not the biggest obstacle when learning anything. So I definitely think that fear is one of the main reasons people are struggling learning languages. If you're fearless, you can learn anything. That's easier said than done, I know. But I've noticed that personally, not only with my story, but also with other people who speak multiple languages, the ones who are fearless, I'm talking about not being afraid to speak, even if they're making mistakes. They are the ones who truly advance in their language learning. And I always encounter people, or even in my immediate circle, saying, well, I really would like to learn X language, but there's always a but. With fear, there is always a but, and that's a problem. So I'm always like, why don't you just go ahead and do it? I have a friend who wanted to learn German. She started learning it, but then realized that the grammar was too hard. Well, I'm not saying that it's easy. Of course, it's hard. But then she quit it, and then she regret quitting it. So I'm like, why didn't you just go on? And she said like she was basically afraid of not being able to catch up with all of the grammar and everything that was coming with the language, because she heard that it was so hard. But just instead of trying it, she basically listened to what everybody else had to say and how the reputation of the language is. Ultimately, she regretted not having continued to learn German. That is why I always say that get rid of fear. That's the first thing you need to get rid of when you find yourself really struggling with a language, or when you find that something is holding you back. That is especially for people who always say, well, I understand, but I can't speak. There's no such thing like I understand, but I can't speak. Of course, you can understand more than you can speak. That's always easier understanding than speaking, but the ultimate goal is to speak. So if you only understand and can't speak, you're not actively using the language. So you are passive in that you're only listening, but you're not actively employing the language. So only understanding and not speaking, of course, that is something, is better than nothing, but still, I would not consider just staying there, but I would advance to the point where I can also express myself in the language, if you wish so. But that's exactly where the problem lies a lot of times for a lot of people, that they can't get over that hurdle of trying to speak because they're so fearful that they will make mistakes, that they will not pronounce correctly, that everybody is going to basically make fun of them, ridicule them for not pronouncing correctly. So a lot of people hold back what they actually can say and what they have to say actually, just because they are fearful to speak. So those are the three factors of fear which are holding you back. First is not to pronounce correctly. Second is not to be understood. And third is ultimately having fear to speak to native speakers, because they are the ones who know it all, right? They're the ones who can speak correctly. They're the ones who supposedly don't make any mistakes. So there's always that fear that if you speak to a native speaker, they're going to think of you badly, or they're going to think, what are you talking about? Or they're not going to be able to understand you at all. But I simply say forget that fear, because this is the biggest fear that hinders you to progress in your language learning. In my personal experience, I never had that fear of speaking, and that is why I think I was able to learn so many languages, because I was always out there, even though I know I was making mistakes. But honestly, I wouldn't care at all. I would not be thinking in my head, okay, am I saying this right now? I just say it. And if it's not correct, then the person is ultimately going to correct me, or I even ask for a correction, because that's the way to go. That's the way to learn actually and progress. And that is how I've been maintaining it, and that's how I've been doing it like all along the years up until now. That is how you're constantly progressing and constantly learning. And in one of my first videos about language learning, I mentioned that fear is, according to me, the number one obstacle for most language learners who are struggling. I have encountered so many people, so many immediate experiences that I've seen where the people themselves did recognize that they were fearful. So if you're that person who is like, well, I understand a lot, but I don't like my accent, I'm afraid that people won't understand me, I just don't know how to pronounce things, well, then I say to you, just go, try it, and you will see for yourself that it will bring nothing but progression. The second reason why you're struggling with language learning, or why most people are struggling with language learning, is, I think, lack of goals, lack of setting goals, which ultimately leads to lack of motivation. I also talked about that in one of my first language learning videos, that lack of motivation is really something that can also be an obstacle when learning languages. We see that all the time in school. In school, if you had to learn Spanish or German or whatever language, most of the times 10 years later, or not even 10 years later, you will barely remember a thing. That is something I see all the time with people who are coming up to me. Oh, I had German in school for 10 years, but I can't remember a thing, just hi. Things like that I see all the time, and this is mainly due to lack of motivation, because in school you're basically forced to learn a language, or a language is put on you, and that's exactly where the problem lies, because you didn't choose it. Most of the times you're not the one who chooses the language. If you choose it, then it's different because you are more motivated to learn it. But if it was put on you, that's not really a choice, and that is something you have to learn. So it's kind of like it becomes more of a task, and language learning should always be related with something being fun. And that is why I always stress so much that language learning should be fun. It should not be seen as a task. That's where I come to the next point. Language learning is in 80% of the cases seen as a task. And language learning for me was never, ever a task. Even when I had it in school, I was lucky enough that I had the choice to learn the languages I wanted to. So I was always more motivated, even though I didn't really like the school methods, how the languages were taught to me, but I was still motivated to learn them. If I wasn't learning them at school, then I was learning them outside of school with my own methods. And that is really something that helped me, because I always had like this drive and this motivation to keep going. So I had multiple reasons to keep liking learning the languages. But if you don't have any reasons to like a language, then very little is gonna stick with you. You might remember some things, but I bet you not a lot, and not for your use where you can actually go out and use what you've learned. I've seen that plenty of times too, with even people who have learned a language in school, didn't learn anything, but then went abroad where the language is spoken, and there they learned a whole bunch because they were surrounded by the language and they had to employ it, and they really got to know everything surrounding the language. Once they put the language in a context, they started to learn more and more, and it started to stick with them. Fourth reason why you're struggling learning languages is, well, this is also something I see all the time, and that is people wanting to learn too much. I get questions all the time of, can I learn Korean? Can I learn Japanese? Can I learn German? Can I learn Spanish? Can I learn Italian? Can I learn Swahili? Like everything at once. When I read some of you guys' messages, I'm like, whoa. Like some people wanting to learn 3, or not even messages, but also your comments like below some of my videos. Some people wanting to learn 3, 4 languages at the time, or not even wanting to learn, but some people are actually learning at least 3 languages at once. And I'm always surprised as to how you're able to manage it. If you're able to manage this, then kudos to you. But for me personally, I also have a video about that, talking about why I don't advise learning more than 2 languages at once. I don't even advise learning 2 languages at once, especially not if they're similar. I explained in 2 videos why I don't advise that. And that is because I've done it myself, and I've had not good experiences with it, where I was always confused because the languages were too similar. So I always try to stick with one language and try to really concentrate and put all my focus on one language. And I find that for me, it is way easier to stick to one language at a time and focus and concentrate on that one so that I don't have side distractions. When I'm learning Spanish, I don't have distractions of Portuguese or whatever other language that is similar, that might be similar, or another language that might be completely different. However, for me, language learning is not just a task, as I said, but it is really something more of a lifestyle. And if it's a lifestyle, I can't live, for me again, I can't live in two different sets of languages at the same time. Of course, you can be bilingual, trilingual, you can do that. So most of the times, if you're learning more than one language at a time, you will either get confused, mix them up if they're similar, or you might go through a lot of struggle. And I always ask myself, why are you wanting to put up with that? Why are you wanting to put that heavy load on yourself? Because you don't have to most of the times, unless it's for school or work. If you're choosing to learn the languages by yourself, why go through that struggle of learning multiple languages at once? I know that it can be exciting, or you just want to learn quickly, but I always advise to just take your time and stick with one. If you can just stick with one language at a time, then that would be best. I also think that, of course, you can try to learn a second language. Let's say you're learning Korean. And once you get to that middle stage, once you get to that intermediate level, I think it's a good level where you can actually express yourself, and it's harder to get mixed up with another language that might be similar. Then from that point on, you can take on another language. So I also did that with, for example, Spanish and Portuguese. Spanish and Portuguese are very similar. And once I was almost fluent in Spanish, I started learning Portuguese. I had already reached a higher level of Spanish, so it was easier to distinguish both languages actually. So if you're finding yourself struggling with a whole bunch of languages, just stop and just stick to one at a time. And once you find yourself advancing in that language and getting to a higher level, getting to a more intermediate level where you cannot actually forget it, then you can go on and learn a second, third, whatever. But I would just always stick to one at a time. It's like this letter method I do. You climb up to a certain height and then you take on something else. You don't want to overload yourself like right from the beginning, because that is actually not going to motivate you, and in the long run not going to benefit you either. Some people can do it, can handle it, of course, but others can. And once you find yourself not being able to handle it, then stop right there. Overall, that was it. So I hope you guys liked this video and got some useful tips out of it. Of course, not every single point I mentioned applies to everybody, but those are the most global ones I encountered with people I know, with people I've talked to. I hope that you could get some useful tips out of what I said, and I see you guys in my next video. Bye.